Well, good day. I just wanted to share how reading some of this silly stuff, like I'll read literature and I'll read philosophy, I'll read psychology, I'll read theology, and why it all tends to fit together. So I've been talking about this idea of the ship of Theseus. It's known as, the family's axe or the family's knife. This idea of when is something um, been changed so much that it's no longer its original thing. Now, what we came from that is we ended up what that could be called would be a combination of the ship of Theseus and the Sorites paradox. This idea of what makes a heap, right? Is one grain of sand a heap? Is 2 grains of sand a heap? They go backwards. They say 1,000,000 grains of sand is a heap. Is 999,000 still a heap? Or is 1 grain still a heap? This relates to Neurath's boat. He goes a little further and he talks about, I talked about this before. It's been expressed to me as we are Neurath's plane, right? This idea that we're constantly remaking ourselves while we're flying. And that obviously was stolen right from Neurath's boat, which is replacing the parts of the ship as you sail, right? So you can only replace one piece at a time. And so what do I mean by this? Well, as I said, Theseus's ship, there's something called the Da Zidulun. In English, it would just be called the Treatise on the Great Prajna Paramita, or the perfection of wisdom in Mahayana Buddhism. The teletransportation paradox, right? Derek Parfit's idea of if we were to copy ourselves, is it the same person or is it someone anew? And so I've heard this idea of the ship of Theseus put forward as a beard, right? When is one beard? It's kind of like a mixture of Theseus's boat. Somebody maybe didn't understand philosophy or just mixed them together, right? Sorites' paradox and the ship of Theseus. So at what point is something a beard, right? When does it turn from a 5 o'clock shadow to a full-on beard? The original explanation I thought was a little awkward. They're like, oh, is one hair a beard? Is 2 hair a beard? As I said, it's an upside down. It's the paradox upside down. Sorites paradox. But what do I mean by this? So how does this inform everything? Healing, trauma, psychology, being, the nature of self, the nature of our issues, even what I call the modern malaise is what Huxley called le malaise de la siècle, which in English would be siècle is like century, or so think of it like modern malaise, right? That's what they're saying. It's a sickness from a period of time, in a period of time, right? So for me, this is exactly what I've come to realize. I've been healing for 10 years and you don't even notice how bad it was and where you've come to. You really actually, especially in healing, you feel like you're still suffering, right? Especially when pain is 80% perception in a lot of cases. How do you know when you've healed? This is the ship of Theseus, right? As the story goes, Theseus traveled all over the known world at the time for 20 years, say, and constantly needing to rebuild the ship. So at what point is it no longer Theseus' ship? Well, again, here's where philosophy comes in again. It's called the bundle theory. And it's just a rewording of Nietzsche's Gestalt, and Nietzsche is just a rewording of what came before that. This idea that we are a bundle, right? In Gestalt, right? I'm looking at my cat lying here, right? Tail and fur and nails and hair and attitude. But you see them as a complete package, the whole package, right? You don't see the individual parts. And so this is what I've tried to experiment with and talk about. Because as I said, that's the way Nietzsche saw it. Identity, myth. But more importantly, as I said, a book that was was writing, I think, building upon Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. Uh, Matthias Desmond, the man many people attribute for popularizing the idea of mass form psychosis. But what I like most is his book, just published this year, I believe, 2023, last year, 2023, I should say, in the last year. He talks about identity as stories that other people tell, that we believe, that we live, when in reality, they need to be myth. They need to be mythos. They need to be the stories that we tell ourselves, our own stories. They don't all have to be true, but they cannot be a lie. Right? The example I've given in the present tense is if you believe you are the greatest person to have ever lived, or in a past tense, right? I talked about traumatized victims who thought they were the cause of their trauma, right? So you need to rewrite that. I'm sure many of us are the cause of our trauma, but not solely, not solely, right? Identity can be applied to our traumas as well. We are a mixture, right? Very few of us could point back to a single trauma that has caused all of this maladaptive response going forward in life. Most of us have had traumas because of the trauma, right? The example I usually would give would be a PTSD veteran who might allow his anger to get in the way of his preferred what have you. Or even more recent, there was a doctor talking about dyslexia and how having dyslexia or any sort of neurodivergent qualities, I think, can cause the same sort of issue. As traumatized children, that's why I think there's such an overlap and a comparison, right? And the same way out. So you can have traumatized children, you can have stressed people, you can have handicapped, to learning disabled, any of these can lead to maladaptive, what they call epigenetics. So I think it's the hypothalamus tends to not be fully functional, or however the science is currently pointing. But these people that are predisposed to trauma, have suffered trauma, have disabilities, or even feel left out, they can actually suffer from brain fog and resting inflammatory issues that are tied to emotional regulation, or vice versa. The inflammatory response can cause emotional regulation issues. Long story short, traumatic brain injury, childhood developmental issues, childhood trauma, learning disabilities, stress at home, trouble sleeping, all of these issues, if allowed to become chronic, can cause this epigenetic change to the human creature. So, in a sense, it's kind of saying, yeah, visualization really does work, right? Particularly in the negative sphere, right? If you're negative about your self esteem and negative about your potential to learn or to grow, it can all lead to this simple situation where in psychology, and this is something that I got directly from Basil van der Kolk's The Body Keeps a Score. And in it, he talks about the problem with healing, and particularly trauma, because I just ran into this myself. I had no idea how far I've come just in the last few months. This is after having learned to read and to think, beginning to learn how to write, tell my own story. Now I'm able to tell and even understand my own story, right? Even before you go and start to write. If you don't know how to think and know how to write, you're not going to be able to understand your own story, let alone tell it. And therefore, you're not going to be able to integrate that and fix any sort of issue. You know what I'm getting at. So I've just realized this myself, what Basil van der Kolk warned about. He said, we are so terrible as human creatures. We're so terrible at seeing incremental growth. If we're getting better bit by bit, we're not going to notice, right? We only notice giant leaps, right? And the example I used to use was most people have resting dehydration. And the example I use, the anecdotal example, is when you convince people to start hydrating properly, right? Taking as much water as they likely could use. Most people fall off the wagon, right? And they go back to their old habits of, you know, drinking, coffee and not much else. And they'll notice after a week of going back to their old habits, that's when they'll notice how incredibly dehydrated, right? They didn't notice before they properly hydrated. It's not that they weren't dehydrated, it just became their normal. Then when they made the new normal being hydrated, they probably didn't notice the absence of the headaches and the brain fog and the fatigue and what have you. But it wasn't until, once again, we go back to our old style and we're dehydrated again and there's the headaches, and that's when we notice it, right? I guess a better example would be Brita water filters. They're these pitchers that you put in a little filter and it'll filter the water. And what's bad about these Brita filters is they only work for a certain length of time. And because of the nature of how the filter works, if you use it for too long, what you're going to end up doing is making your water worse. It's not going to filter. It's actually going to make the water a lot worse. Right? But even that is hard for us to notice because, as anecdotal evidence, I drink a lot of tea for my hydration because there's some anti-inflammatory benefits to the herbal tea that I use. So I don't drink a lot of water, right? The way I see it is I try to drink my equivalent of water I get from the tea. So I get, it's fully hydrating. It's not a diuretic in any way, the herbal tea that I use. So I'm getting the positive compounds, the anti-inflammatory compounds, as well as, well, flavor. It makes it easier to drink, gallons of water a day. But for the last couple of weeks, since we've been using this Brita, I've been almost exclusively drinking mint tea. And so it's been my wife drinking the water from the Brita pitcher. And I just realized, wow, that filter has been in there for so long that, it's gone past the point where it was making the water taste better to the point where the water was not better. It really wouldn't have been any better than tap water. But it was used for so long at this point, I was pretty sure it was probably not only not filtering the water, but what it does is it was releasing the other trapped compounds that it had filtered out previously. Like that's the negative side effect, or the negative whatever. You understand what I mean? That's not the greatest part of the Brita. That you know what I mean? You have to decide when the water's no longer tasting better. But in this case, it went so bad that it just wasn't given as a thought, that the water was horrible. Oh my God, did it ever taste bad? And I knew this because all I did was just drizzle a little bit of the water on my hand and just gave it a little slurp. And boy, it was terrible. Way worse than tap water. But of course, my wife didn't notice the water going from filtered to less filtered to less filtered. And she certainly, for some reason, even missed when it went from filtered to, not filtered anymore. And even worse, tasted terrible. But once I changed the filter, she made at least 3 or 4 comments. Oh my God, she says the water's so good. It tastes so good. That's the human experience. Sadly, right? Hindsight is 2020. It's the same idea here, right? We only appreciate what we have once we've lost it, or all of these cliches. You got to fake it till you make it. It's the same idea. If our goal is to heal, well, then you can't be gauging your healing on a daily basis. It's almost similar to when you're trying to lose weight. You can't rely on weighing yourself every day because you will fluctuate. That's just normal, right? And you're risking, demotivating yourself. But in this case, is worse than that, because we have to just keep the faith for so long until the evidence of our success is undeniable. But until then, we're going to doubt our path. Oh, I apologize. So the final thought I wanted to put in this is how it applies to identity, as well as who we are, the healed self, as it were. There's a philosopher by the name of Derek Parfit, and he played on this idea of teleportation or teletransportation, right? You think of the Star Trek. And so there's this idea in teleportation, if you were to transport someone, the way the philosophy works is you're recreating the individual in another place, and you're destroying the original copy. And so the argument goes, well, what if you didn't destroy the original? Would you just be creating copies, clones? And I argue, copies of what? You're going to copy the physical, and this is a hard thing for a lot of people to admit, but the consciousness, the self, the individual, the identity is not found within the physical. So the first moment that you teleport someone, you're actually going to find that it's not that person. It's not that being. It's the physical copy, but it's not them, who they are. It's not their bundle. It's this idea of Theseus's ship. We've learned to separate the wood that makes up the ship to this idea of what is Theseus's ship, right? The way I explain it is, well, if Theseus, and the way the story goes is Theseus, every time he docked, right, they were doing repairs. But what if he pulled into one of these ports and just got on another ship and sailed away? That's not the same ship at all. It completely breaks the idea of rebuilding and replacing pieces, right? This idea, I think it was Socrates, right? No man can cross the same river twice because he's not the same man and it's not the same river. But if Theseus just hopped on another boat and sailed away, well, that becomes Theseus's ship. Even if it was a rowboat, well, that becomes Theseus's boat. And that's this bundle theory. It's the Gestalt. So we have to realize that we are the individual. This is where it gets a little deeper. So as I said, you're not any one of those little parts, right? It's all the little parts go together to make up who you are. But at the same time, if you take away any of those little parts, you risk who you are. And the most extreme example would be this teletransportation. That if we were to clone our physical being and transport to another place, until we figure out what and where the consciousness resides, we're just going to have a bag of meat on one end and the human being in the original. But as I've said, are we risking the very being, the very human itself? Because we keep embracing these false identities and letting go of what and who we truly are. Right? The way I might explain it is, if you go to school and learn how to memorize everything, I mean, as I did, I got through most of my schooling by just memorizing. I didn't know how to read and write like the average kid. So I could play the part of a human being. But arguably, was I really? And what I mean by that is these philosophers that have warned us that if we stopped living an authentic life, if we stopped thinking for ourselves, and arguably, if we just stopped thinking, would we cease to be agents? Would we become a herd beast? Would we become automatons? In the old speak, modern language would be a non-player character. And I argue, yes, I think we're at that point now. But as I mentioned this morning, talking about dyslexia, I think the problem with many of us is not that we don't have the ability to learn. I've talked about this with language. I think it's a complete misunderstanding of learning. It is harder to learn another language when you get older, but it's not impossible. It's not even really any more difficult than it is for a child. As I said, the difference is the child doesn't have a choice. We don't give him a choice, him or her a choice. They must learn the language. The better example would be Georgian, the language. It's commonly known as the most difficult language on the planet. And the reason why I mention it is it's also commonly known that Georgian is not a language you're going to learn to speak unless you're a native. Right? You might be able to get literate. Right? You might be able to read and write and spell, but you'll never be fluent. Right? I've tried to explain this literacy versus fluency. I'm not talking about being a native speaker. Right? That's a whole separate issue. Yes, native speaker will become fluent because they are forced to, especially the Georgians, right? You have no other language, you're going to learn this infinitely complicated language. But what I'm talking about is becoming fluent in the language, because never have we seen so many people that are literate and yet so few that are fluent. How many times have we seen it with our own languages? Right? You only speak one language, but barely. So I argue this is just an example of this failure to teach our children and ourselves to think. We cannot just memorize facts, because the idea of the Theseus boat, memorizing facts, you're building the boat. But it takes the mind, the thinker, the agent, the individual to, well, take their place on that boat and thus create the identity of Theseus's boat, his ship. So many of us are literate. So many of us have built our ships, but we're mired in, well, ignorance, or people have told us we're unable to do these things. So we're stuck in the mud, waiting for the tide to bring us out, when in reality there is no tide. Right? The tide is already set sail with all of the other ships that didn't have the extra weight or issues that some of us had. They were able to wade their way through the shallows into the deeper water. They didn't need the tide, and yet the tide didn't really raise all boats. So what I think we're seeing here is decades worth of what would you say, decades worth of ignoring the importance of education. And when I say that, I'm not talking about a degree, as so many people now are paying for these post-secondary degrees. And when I take courses with them, I really doubt whether they learned anything in these classes. Right? Until we stop and realize, well, that is where our issue lies, is that we're on our second or third or even fourth generation of students who have never been taught to think. So if they suffer a trauma or they run into something new, what are they going to do? Right? This is what Nietzsche warned us. He called it the ressentiment. They'll just continue to be reactive beings. So once again, I highlight the only way out of this for years. right? My studies, I thought it was Buddhism, mindfulness, focus, controlling that emotional regulation. It can, it can help. You can help grow some of that hypothalamus back, get some normal function. But as I said, it seems to me until we can learn to be complete beings, until we can really think our way out of a wet paper bag, I think we'll all be trapped in our trauma. And I don't ever really specifically mean an individual event, even. I think we'll be trapped in our trauma, whatever the trauma may be. Your parents told you weren't good enough. I guess the example, it's in his autobiography, so I don't think he minds me sharing this. But Henry Winkler, the guy that played the Fonz, he was severely dyslexic as well, and he covered it similar to the way I did by being bombastic and what have you. But his own parents had a nickname for him, and I can't remember what the German was, but a stupid dog. They called him a stupid dog. And of course, it's really sad. He really, really, really does. Oh, because later he talks about how his mother and his wife said she only wants to be around because you're famous now. But he said his mother gave him a new nickname, but it wasn't until after he became famous. Right? I mean, this says it all, right? You couldn't separate from Henry Winkler, the little guy, the little dude, little Hank Winkler. You couldn't separate his dyslexia from who he was as a little person. In fact, arguably what makes Henry Winkler such a wonderful guy, if you've ever heard about him, supposedly he's such a wonderful human being, right? Fame supposedly hasn't got to him. I think it has. It's just, I think, in no small part, having grown up as a dyslexic and the child of parents that I know, right? I know all about. It was that self-esteem thing. So what a lot of people read as humble, if you read his autobiography, in reality, it's him feeling like he isn't worthy, even though he's 50 years from his parents calling him a dumb dog, even though he's 20 years from his diagnosis as a dyslexic. He still hasn't labeled that dumb dog as a lie, right? Not everything has to be true, but it cannot be a lie. But it's identity, right? Because you couldn't separate his dyslexia from who he was, so his parents should have loved that part of him as much as every other part, right? Because the opposite is true, very telling, that his mother fell in love with a part that wasn't even him, his fame, his notoriety. That arguably plays such a tiny part in who he truly was as a person. So to embrace that, to celebrate that, when who he is, his dyslexia has defined him for his entire life, particularly his childhood, right? Because remember, Henry Winkler, as a Jew, he was unable to read Hebrew, because I've run into that. I've explained that when I learned Sanskrit and Pali, I didn't waste my time trying to learn the characters. I just learned Sanskrit and the phonetic pronunciations, and that's how I do my study, right? I'll use computers to do the translation of the characters, because, well, I mean, I can tell you, I'd still be trying to figure it out probably, right? I wouldn't have moved on to other languages and other philosophies, right? I wouldn't have my understanding of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, as well as all the Buddhist sutras, if I hadn't have set that part of me aside. So if I hadn't embraced the fact that I can hear these subtle variations in tones, these phonemes, and I can hear different languages, if no small part what they used to say was a negative, that because of my dyslexia, I should not have been exposed to French. certainly not in a bilingual way. But arguably, once again, they were wrong. Because if I hadn't have been, I may not have found where my true forte lay. Right? It's language for me where I shine. But it's not the Poindextery type language where, I'm going to become a scholar of Sanskritam. But in reality, it's very similar to the Bible. You can read the English Bible. I mean, you can choose a translation that can get pretty darn close. But as I've said, the best example is love. Love, sometimes translated as charity in the Bible. In the Greek, can be agape, can be philo, philo, phyla. It could be Augustine liked carnitas. Hannah Arendt's doctoral thesis, or whatever you have it, was on Augustine's caritas, love. But for me, it's the chesed of the Hebrew, because it resonates with the Buddhists, right? Metta, maitri. This is a loving kindness. Loving kindness, a word that was invented to translate that word, chesed, or agape, or metta, or maitri. Imagine in our language us not having a word for a type of love that transcends our physical limitations, transcends our hate and our jealousy, right? You can point to 1955. Huxley gave a speech to the Vedanta Society. And in it, he said, well, what is self? Who are we? And he talked about this Sat Chit Ananda. That's the heart of what and who we are. Sat is all of creation. Chit is our consciousness. Ananda is joy or bliss. Right? When we see the Sat in our Chit and our Chit in our Sat, that is true Ananda, true bliss. It's the sixth line of the Isha Upanishad, one of the first Upanishads, where it speaks that seeing the self in the other and seeing the other in the self, you have no aversions, you have no issues. And I've seen that myself this morning even, is that love is inherently the heart of all of this endeavor, same as self. It's a matter of a balance, right? We're looking for a balance, a middle way, a madhyamaka, right? So easily misunderstood in the Buddhist idea of thirst, tanha, often translated as desire. And so many people get all tied up with that because, well, desire, you're not giving up all desire, same as you're not giving up all self. What you're giving up is this selfish conception of the self, a selfish conception of love. Right? I mean, another example is one of the boundless joys in Buddhism. It's empathetic joy. Geez, off the top of my head here, I can't remember now. But empathetic joy, mudita. Empathetic joy in the Buddhist idea is something that I used to explain a lot because it's rare, particularly in the West. How many of us have trouble being happy for another's success? And even more so when we are having a hard time ourselves. That's the sort of boundless energies that the Buddhists talk about. What do they mean? It's this idea that empathetic joy is something that you can develop by engaging it. Right? It's the opposite to the energies we're trying to defeat. Jealousy. If you feel pangs of jealousy for those that you care about or for those that you interact with, how can you overcome that negative perception? It's by embracing your empathetic joy. Being happy for the other person reduces your jealousy, makes you happy, makes them happy. But it's all perception. That's the hardest part. How do you decide if you're progressing? How do you decide if you're getting better? Well, it really is us, right? As Nietzsche said, right, Gestalt can also be an idea of a creation, right? So we have two choices, right? You must embrace all the aspects that make up who you are. And I think this is what influenced Jung's individuation. Because if you follow Nietzsche's idea of the Gestalt and becoming truly who we are, authentic, and not just, herd beast or just built on expectations that others have put forward, that someday we could aim ourselves towards the light, towards the star that is the Ubermensch, right? Turn to light, and then maybe someday we could achieve uh, a sort of integration, as Jung said, that I agree with, this idea that we have within us a good and a bad, a light and a dark side. And it's the balance. I mean, modern psychology even goes so far as to agreeing with Jung, this idea that we have within us the male and the female, the animus and the anima. And it's integration that's required, not a denial of one aspect or another. Because the idea is if you deny too much of one aspect of yourself, it actually, as Nietzsche said, all suppressed truths become toxic. Right? And as Carl Friston says in his Free Energy, completely secular in this idea of how we live in our daily life, we perceive a small portion of what there is to perceive. We try to make it perspectival. We try to perceive what will help us in our journey. The mind is there to help us predict what may come and use the imagination to keep track of previous, right? We're trying to have a predictive matrix improve. But the problem lies, and Carl Friston suggests this may be the idea of mental illness, that when reality is presented to us, if it doesn't align with the predictive matrix, so if reality doesn't match with our expectations, we could be at risk of denying reality, which arguably he may have predicted where we're at now. Right? How many times on a daily basis do you run into somebody who's living an identity that is pretty obviously a lie and certainly not the truth, and they pretty obviously don't realize how this is not going to serve them going forward, right? How many people think driving a fancy car is going to solve their issues, right? Midlife crises, right? Smoking or quitting smoking. How many people think it's going to be a major change in who and what we are? When in reality, it's just one little aspect. And this is what Jung was trying to get at. Will never truly be until we integrate all of these little facets. I love that, the idea of a facet, right? The little pieces, all of these little mirrors that go together, make up who we are, right? And so I'll just leave you on my favorite Japanese expression, aphorism, whatever it may be. This idea that it goes one step deeper than Freud, right? Freud or Nietzsche or Jung, for that matter. This idea that we're all players upon the stage, right? Actors, not agents, actors. Because we live out our persona. We're not being real or authentic. And as the Japanese say, we wear three faces. One we show to the world, another we may show to those we love, those we trust, and another face, another persona that we may never even show ourselves. Look